At first glance, this looked like an ordinary evening. A family dinner, a quiet ride home, a garage door opening, then closing. Federal agents joined local investigators. Authorities are careful with their words. The family is pleading publicly. And investigators are operating as if this disappearance didn't just happen. It was done. Tonight, we're breaking down what's known, what's been confirmed, and why this case has become one of the most disturbing and complex investigations unfolding right now. This is everything you need to know, so far. 1. The last normal night. Reconstructing Nancy Guthrie's final known hours. When investigators look at a disappearance like this, they don't start with theories. They start with routine. What a person normally does, where they normally go, and how closely the last confirmed hours match that pattern. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, that routine is precisely what makes her disappearance so alarming. On Saturday, January 31st, 2026, everything appeared normal. Nancy, 84 years old, spent the evening with family, the most ordinary and reassuring detail imaginable. At approximately 5:32 p.m., she took an Uber to the home of her daughter, Annie Guthrie, in the Tucson, Arizona area. It was simply a family dinner. Later that night, at 9:48 p.m., Annie's husband drove Nancy back to her own home. This moment matters more than it seems. Investigators have confirmed this was the last verified in-person sighting of Nancy Guthrie by anyone who knew her personally. 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., her garage door closed. That timestamp, 9:50 p.m., has become one of the most important anchors in the entire case. Why? Because it establishes that Nancy made it home safely. There is no evidence she wandered away on the drive. No suggestion she was intercepted before reaching her residence. The garage door opening and closing confirms arrival, entry, and isolation inside her own home. Whatever happened next occurred after that moment. And then, nothing. No outgoing phone calls, no messages, no movement captured on saved surveillance footage. The night passes quietly, at least on the surface. The following morning, Sunday, February 1st, the first crack in the routine appears. Nancy does not attend church. For some people, that might not raise alarms. For Nancy's family, it was immediately concerning. Church attendance wasn't casual for her. It was consistent, habitual, and deeply ingrained. Family members have described it as a fixed point in her weekly life. When she didn't arrive, concerns set in quickly. By later that day, she was reported missing. This timeline is crucial because it compresses the window dramatically. Nancy was last seen at 9:48 p.m. Saturday night. By Sunday morning, she was already gone. Investigators are not dealing with days of uncertainty, they are dealing with hours. For an elderly woman with known medical needs, those omissions are not minor. They are red flags. From an investigative standpoint, this immediately weakens the possibility of a voluntary disappearance. People who leave intentionally almost always take communication devices, medications, or personal items. Nancy left behind the tools that would have helped her survive even a short absence. That reality reframes the entire case. Law enforcement has made it clear, sometimes directly, sometimes through implication, Nancy had just spent time with family. There was no reported conflict, no argument, no emotional distress. In missing person cases, emotional triggers often precede voluntary disappearance. Here, the emotional environment was stable, familiar, and calm. That's why investigators focus so intensely on the overnight hours. Between roughly 10 p.m. Saturday and early Sunday morning, something changed the trajectory of Nancy Guthrie's life. And whatever that change was, it happened quietly enough to avoid immediate detection, but violently or forcefully enough to leave behind evidence that would later alarm investigators. It tells us that Nancy didn't drift away slowly. She didn't fade from routine over time. Her disappearance was sudden, disruptive, and out of character. The kind of break that investigators associate with intervention, not accident. And once routine breaks this cleanly, the investigation moves into a far more serious category. 2. The house that went quiet. Surveillance gaps, missing data, and the overnight window. Once investigators confirmed that Nancy arrived home safely, attention shifted immediately to the house itself. In missing person cases involving seniors, The home often tells the story. Nancy's iPhone was found inside the house. For investigators, this matters enormously. Phones are lifelines, especially for elderly individuals. Leaving it behind strongly suggests Nancy did not plan to go anywhere. More importantly, it suggests she may not have had the opportunity to take it. Then there was the surveillance issue. Nancy's home was equipped with a doorbell camera system. Under normal circumstances, this would provide a clear record of comings and goings. But investigators quickly discovered something was wrong. The doorbell camera had been disconnected at 1:47 a.m., hours after Nancy arrived home. That detail alone is troubling. Camera systems don't typically disconnect themselves in the middle of the night. Power failures can happen, but investigators noted something more deliberate. The device appeared to have been physically removed. This wasn't a software glitch or accidental outage. It was interference. Even more unsettling, the system still detected motion at 2:12 a.m., after the camera had already gone offline. Because Nancy did not have an active cloud subscription, no video footage was saved, only the movement log. This creates a narrow but critical investigative window. Between roughly 1:47 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., something happened at or near the house, and whatever it was, it occurred when the neighborhood was at its quietest. Another key data point intersects with this same window: Nancy's pacemaker. Investigators confirmed that her pacemaker, which transmits data via Wi-Fi. From an investigative standpoint, this convergence is significant. It suggests a moment where Nancy's normal environment was disrupted. Power, connectivity, movement, or control over her surroundings changed suddenly. The geography of the area adds another layer. Nancy's neighborhood is intentionally dark to accommodate nearby observatories. Law enforcement has been careful not to overstate conclusions, but their actions speak clearly. This is not being treated as a routine welfare check gone wrong. Detectives have returned to the house repeatedly, focusing on infrastructure, access points, and overlooked angles. They examined nearby utility features, including a manhole. They searched a septic tank near the property. They towed Nancy's vehicle from the garage, not because it was missing, but because it needed to be examined. This behavior signals a shift. At this stage, investigators are no longer asking, "Where did she go?" They are asking, "What happened here?" The overnight window is now the spine of the investigation. Everything before it is routine. Everything after it is chaos. And whatever occurred during those few hours changed this case from a missing senior to a potential crime. The house didn't just go quiet. It was made quiet. Section 3. When the FBI steps in, why this case escalated so fast. What happened in Nancy Guthrie's case broke from that pattern almost immediately. Within days, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was involved. That escalation is not automatic. The FBI does not step into every missing person case, and certainly not without specific indicators. Their presence signals that investigators believe the circumstances may involve interstate activity. According to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI joined the investigation to assist with technical analysis, message authentication, and behavioral assessment. That detail matters. It tells us where investigators think the case is headed. By this point, the narrative had shifted. This was no longer being described as a missing elderly woman. Law enforcement began using language associated with foul play, even if carefully and without formal declaration. Press briefings became more guarded. Information slowed. The house was resecured as a potential crime scene, and then came the messages. In hoax-heavy cases, authorities often dismiss early messages quickly. Here, they didn't. They analyzed metadata, writing patterns, delivery methods, and technical markers. The FBI's involvement strongly suggests that at least some of these communications were sophisticated enough to warrant serious scrutiny. Investigators also announced a $50,000 reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery or an arrest. This move further confirms investigators believe this case involves human decision-making, not accident. Behind the scenes, law enforcement activity intensified. Search operations were not random. They were targeted. Officers returned repeatedly to Nancy's neighborhood, sometimes after periods of apparent inactivity. At one point, crime scene tape was reinstalled after being removed, signaling new developments or new evidence requiring preservation. This kind of stop-start activity is typical in complex investigations, where new information arrives unexpectedly, often from digital sources. Another crucial detail: the family requested a continued law enforcement presence at Nancy's home. That request speaks volumes. Families don't usually ask for police presence unless they fear ongoing risk, either from media attention, potential suspects, or further interference with evidence. In high-profile cases, as investigators worked to authenticate messages, one suspect was arrested. A California man accused of impersonating the abductor and sending a fraudulent Bitcoin ransom demand. Authorities were quick to clarify that this arrest did not resolve the case and was not directly linked to earlier ransom messages sent to media outlets. That clarification is critical. It means investigators are dealing with multiple layers of noise: real leads, false leads, hoaxes, and opportunists exploiting public attention. This is one of the most dangerous phases of any investigation because bad information can derail real progress. Throughout all of this, one thing remained consistent. Law enforcement never downgraded the seriousness of the case. They did not suggest Nancy wandered away. They did not frame it as confusion. They did not reduce urgency. Instead, every move, FBI involvement, reward money, forensic analysis, controlled messaging, points to a belief that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance involved deliberate action by another person or persons. At this stage, investigators are not asking if a crime occurred. They are trying to determine who, how, and where she was taken, and whether time is still on their side. Section 4. Ransom messages, Bitcoin demands, and the fog of hoaxes. The moment when real investigation collides with public noise. For Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, that moment arrived with the emergence of ransom messages. At first, the communications were indirect. Rather than contacting law enforcement or the family through clear, traceable channels, messages claiming to be connected to Nancy's disappearance began appearing at media outlets. Nancy had been taken, and money was being demanded for her return. Law enforcement's response was cautious, deliberately so. Sheriff Chris Nanos emphasized that these messages were being treated like any other piece of evidence. What investigators saw here was fragmented, inconsistent, and spread across multiple recipients. One of the messages reportedly included specific details about what Nancy was wearing, information that had not been released publicly. That immediately elevated concern. Either the sender had direct knowledge, or they had access to leaked or insider information. Still, law enforcement refused to confirm authenticity. Why? Because false confidence can destroy a case. That caution proved justified. On February 5th, federal authorities arrested a California man accused of sending fraudulent ransom messages to the Guthrie family, demanding Bitcoin. Investigators were quick to stress that this individual was not confirmed to be responsible for Nancy's disappearance, only for exploiting the situation. This arrest underscored the core problem investigators were facing: signal versus noise. Despite the arrest, authorities made it clear that other messages were still under review. Not all communications were connected. Not all were dismissed. Some remained unresolved. Behind the scenes, analysts were asking difficult questions. Why contact media instead of family? Why multiple deadlines without clear follow-up? Why no verified proof of life? Why spread messages across platforms instead of controlling communication? Meanwhile, investigators returned repeatedly to Nancy's home after the arrival of new messages. They searched the roof, the garage, and the backyard. Her vehicle was towed for examination. These actions suggest that at least one message contained information serious enough to trigger renewed physical searches, even if authenticity remained unconfirmed. This is the investigative paradox the case now sits in. If law enforcement ignores a real message, the Guthrie family, caught in the middle, faces an impossible emotional calculus. Public pleas can generate tips, but they can also attract predators and scammers. every statement becomes both a lifeline and a liability. At this stage, the ransom layer of the case is not clarity, it's fog. And investigators are moving through it carefully, knowing that one wrong assumption could make an already tragic situation irreversible. 5. Blood evidence and medical reality. When fear turns into proof. Up to this point, the Nancy Guthrie case had lived in the space between suspicion and uncertainty. Disturbing indicators were present: surveillance gaps, device failures, ransom messages, but none of them alone confirmed physical harm. That changed when investigators publicly acknowledged a critical finding. Blood was discovered at Nancy's home. More importantly, it was confirmed to be hers. From an investigative standpoint, this is the moment the case crosses a threshold. Blood evidence immediately alters how law enforcement classifies risk, urgency, and probability. It does not automatically confirm death, but it does confirm that a physical event occurred at or near the residence. Sheriff's officials stated that the blood was located on the porch area and that it had been rushed to a crime lab for expedited analysis. In normal circumstances, DNA processing can take weeks. In this case, investigators prioritized it, signaling how seriously they viewed the discovery. Why does this matter so much? Because it eliminates several benign explanations at once. A voluntary departure becomes far less plausible. A simple medical episode without intervention becomes unlikely. An unnoticed fall, followed by wandering, becomes harder to support. Blood suggests struggle, injury, or force, all of which point outward, not inward. Law enforcement has been careful not to speculate publicly about the amount of blood or the nature of the injury. That restraint is deliberate. Revealing too much can contaminate witness statements or alert a suspect to what investigators know. But even without those details, the confirmation itself reshapes the entire case. At the same time, investigators emphasized another critical factor: Nancy's medical dependency. She required daily medication. She also relied on a pacemaker, a device that does not simply support quality of life, but actively sustains it. By the time blood evidence was confirmed, several days had already passed without any indication that she was receiving medical care. That reality introduces a second layer of urgency. Even in scenarios where an abduction victim survives initial harm, lack of medication can quickly become fatal, especially for someone in their 80s. This is why investigators have repeatedly stressed the time-sensitive nature of the case, even as days continue to pass. It also explains the guarded tone law enforcement has adopted. They are not speaking in absolutes. They are not offering reassurance. They are operating under worst-case assumptions, because the evidence demands it. Blood evidence doesn't answer where Nancy is. It doesn't identify who is responsible. But it does something just as important. It tells investigators, and the public, that this case is no longer about hope alone. It is about harm, time, and accountability. From this point forward, every lead is treated as a potential rescue effort, or a recovery effort. And that distinction weighs heavily on everyone involved. 6. The family's public plea: hope, risk, and the cost of visibility. As days passed with no resolution, the Guthrie family faced a decision no family should ever have to make: stay silent and trust the investigation, or speak directly to whoever might be responsible, knowing that doing so could help or harm the case. They chose to go public. In a video released to the media, Nancy's children made a direct appeal. Their message was simple, emotional, and devastatingly human. They acknowledged receiving communications. They expressed belief that their mother could still be alive. And they made a statement that immediately drew attention. They were willing to pay. From a human perspective, the plea is entirely understandable. When a loved one's life may be at stake, moral calculations collapse into a single priority: bring them home. From an investigative perspective, however, this move is fraught with danger. Public pleas can generate legitimate tips. They can pressure a real abductor to act. They can also trigger exactly the opposite: an explosion of hoaxes, scams, and opportunists seeking money or attention. Law enforcement is acutely aware of this risk, which is why officials carefully avoided endorsing or validating any ransom communication publicly. The family's appeal exists inside a tactical paradox. Visibility can save lives. Visibility can also make things worse. Investigators must now manage two parallel realities. One is the emotional urgency of a family speaking to a potential captor. The other is the operational need to avoid contaminating evidence, empowering imposters, or signaling desperation that could be exploited.